Margaret Wilson had always prided herself on her independence. At 62, she had retired for a distinguished 30-year career with the FBI, though few in her new community at Aspen Ridge knew about her background. She had purposefully kept her past profession quiet, preferring to be known simply as Margaret, the friendly new resident with a slight breathing condition who had moved to be closer to her son, James. Aspen Ridge was governed by a notoriously strict homeowners association, led by the imperious Deborah Harrington, a former real estate agent who ruled the community with an iron fist disguised in designer clothing. Rules were not merely guidelines at Aspen Ridge. They were commandments carved in stone, with violations met with swift and often disproportionate consequences. Margaret had purchased her modest townhouse 6 months ago, decorating it with mementos from her past career and managing her mild asthma with regular medication and an inhaler she kept with her at all times. She had reviewed the HOA bylaws carefully before purchasing, finding them excessive but manageable. What she hadn't anticipated was how those bylaws would be interpreted and enforced by the people behind them. The morning sun filtered through Margaret's kitchen window as she sipped her coffee, observing her new neighbourhood from her breakfast nook. Aspen Ridge presented a pristine facade, identical roof shingles, approved colour schemes, and meticulously maintained lawns. In her 3 decades with the Bureau, Margaret had learned to look beyond facades, to see the power structures that maintained them and the costs they exacted. Her doorbell rang precisely at 9:00 a.m., right on schedule. Margaret opened the door to find Eleanor Pruitt, a retired schoolteacher and her self-appointed community ambassador. "Good morning, Margaret," Eleanor chirped. "Just wanted to remind you about the quarterly HOA dues. They're due by Friday." "Already paid online," Margaret replied with a smile. "I set up auto payment when I moved in." Eleanor's smile flickered momentarily. "Oh, well, that's efficient. Most residents prefer the personal touch of dropping off checks at the community office. Deborah likes to greet everyone personally." "I'm sure she does," Margaret said, noticing Eleanor's gaze drifting to the small potted herbs on her porch. "Is there a problem with my basil?" "Oh, no, not at all. Though decorative items on the front porch do require prior approval from the Exterior Aesthetics Committee. I don't recall seeing your application cross my desk." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though years of interrogation training had taught her to recognize intent. "Herbs aren't decorative items, Eleanor. They're classified as temporary container gardening under Section 4.23 of the bylaws, which allows for up to 3 potted plants under 12 inches in height without prior approval." Eleanor blinked rapidly. "You've read the bylaws, cover to cover." "Twice." Margaret smiled. "I like to know what I'm agreeing to." After Eleanor left, Margaret returned to her coffee, now cold. She gazed out at the row of identical houses, each with its identical lawn and identical mailbox. In her career, she had infiltrated criminal organizations, tracked financial malfeasance across international borders, and stared down hardened criminals in interrogation rooms. None of that had prepared her for the peculiar tyranny of Aspen Ridge. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "How's the new place, Mom? HOA driving you crazy yet?" Margaret smiled as she typed her reply. "Nothing I can't handle. Looking forward to your visit this weekend." She deliberately omitted mentioning the yellow landscaping pre-violation warning that had appeared on her door yesterday regarding the bird feeder in her backyard. Some battles weren't worth worrying her son about. Yet. The trouble began when Margaret planted a small garden of native wildflowers in her front yard, replacing the water-hungry lawn with drought-resistant species. Though she had submitted the proper paperwork, Deborah deemed the garden unsightly and lowering property values. The first notice arrived 3 days after the planting was complete. "This is ridiculous," Margaret muttered, placing the violation notice on her kitchen counter. The bylaws specifically allow for xeriscape landscaping. The morning after receiving the notice, Margaret stood in her garden with her neighbour, Frank Chen, a retired botanist who had quietly offered guidance on her plant selection. "These are all native species," Frank said, kneeling to examine a cluster of black-eyed Susans. "Drought-resistant, pollinator-friendly. Exactly what the County Conservation Board has been recommending." "Tell that to the HOA," Margaret replied, showing him the violation notice. "According to this, I've created an eyesore inconsistent with community aesthetics." Frank sighed. "Deborah did the same thing to my vegetable garden last year. I ended up moving everything to the backyard." He glanced around nervously. "Just be careful. She doesn't like being challenged." Margaret smiled. "Neither do I." That evening, she meticulously prepared her case, assembling a presentation with the precision she had once reserved for federal investigations. She printed relevant sections of the bylaws, highlighted inconsistencies in enforcement, and gathered photographs documenting similar landscaping projects that had been approved for board members' homes. Margaret attended the next HOA meeting, arriving early to set up her materials at a front table. The community room filled quickly, with many residents nodding politely toward Margaret, a courtesy that didn't escape Deborah's notice as she swept in 5 minutes late, immaculately dressed in a tailored blazer and pearls. "Let's begin with old business," Deborah announced, deliberately avoiding the agenda item Margaret had submitted. "Point of order," Margaret called calmly, raising her hand. According to the meeting procedures outlined in Section 7.1 of the bylaws, new violations should be addressed before moving to old business. A murmur rippled through the room. Few residents ever cited the bylaws, and fewer still challenged Deborah's procedural authority. Deborah's smile tightened. "Mrs. Wilson, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, we have an established order of operations for these meetings, which contradicts your own written procedures," Margaret responded, her voice level. She distributed her handouts to nearby residents. "I'm simply requesting that we follow the rules as written." With reluctance visible in every movement, Deborah yielded the floor. Margaret calmly presented her case with printed copies of the relevant bylaws and photographs of her garden. Her presentation was logical, precise, and delivered with the same clarity she had once used in FBI briefings. Several neighbours nodded in agreement, which only seemed to intensify Deborah's opposition. "While the bylaws do allow for alternative landscaping," Deborah said with a tight smile, "the Architectural Review Committee has determined that your particular implementation fails to meet our community standards." "And what exactly are those standards?" Margaret asked, noticing how several committee members avoided eye contact. "The bylaws require that all standards be documented and available to homeowners. I've requested those documents 3 times in writing." The meeting grew heated as Margaret continued questioning the specifics of these standards. Her breathing became laboured as her frustration mounted, and she reached for her inhaler, taking a puff before continuing her questions. "Furthermore," she said, holding up photographs, "these derriscate gardens at 342 and 356 Aspen Way were approved last month. The only difference I can identify is that those properties belong to board members." A tense silence fell over the room. Margaret had done what no one else dared. She had documented the board's selective enforcement, and done so with evidence too clear to dismiss. 2 weeks later, Margaret received a second violation notice regarding an American flag she had hung on her porch. According to the notice, the flag bracket was mounted incorrectly, extending 2 inches beyond the allowed space. The fine was $150. Margaret photographed the bracket with a measuring tape, clearly showing it was within the prescribed limits. She then drafted a formal appeal letter, attaching the evidence and citing Section 12.4 of the bylaws regarding the right to display the American flag. She hand-delivered it to the HOA office, where the secretary accepted it with wide eyes. "You're actually appealing," the young woman whispered. "Nobody appeals Deborah's notices." "Perhaps they should," Margaret replied evenly. That evening, Margaret's doorbell rang. She opened the door to find 3 of her neighbours standing nervously on her porch. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Carlos from down the block. This is Susan and Mike. We heard about your appeal," the younger man said. Margaret invited them in, offering tea as they settled in her living room. "We've all received similar notices," Susan explained. "Mike's handicap ramp was cited for being the wrong shade of grey. My bird bath was deemed an unauthorised water feature. Deborah runs this place like her personal fiefdom," Carlos added. "But nobody stands up to her because she's vindictive. Challenge 1 violation, and suddenly you'll have 3 more." Margaret listened carefully, her investigator's mind cataloguing the pattern of abuses. "Have you documented these incidents?" They hadn't, of course. Fear had kept them compliant, paying fines rather than risking escalation. "With your permission," Margaret said, "I'd like to collect your experiences. Names can remain confidential for now." James visited that weekend, finding his mother at her dining table, surrounded by folders containing statements from 12 neighbours and a meticulously cross-referenced spreadsheet of violation notices. "Mom, is this really worth your health?" he asked, noticing how she periodically reached for her inhaler. "You know stress triggers your asthma." "It's the principle, James," Margaret replied. "This isn't about flowers or flags. It's about arbitrary enforcement and intimidation. I've spent my career standing up to bullies with far more power than Deborah Harrington." "Just promise me you'll be careful," James said, examining the wall where Margaret had created a timeline of HOA violations. "This looks like one of your case boards from the bureau." Margaret smiled. Old habits. The annual community pool party the following Saturday became the flashpoint. Margaret arrived early, carrying a small cooler containing her inhaler and water, setting up her chair in a shaded area as her doctor had recommended. Several neighbours greeted her warmly. Her reputation as the HOA challenger had spread throughout Aspen Ridge. Deborah approached immediately, her heels kicking aggressively on the pool deck. Her eyes narrowed at the small cluster of residents chatting with Margaret. "The party doesn't begin for another 30 minutes, she announced loudly. "And residents are not allowed to reserve spaces before the official start time." "I'm not reserving anything," Margaret explained calmly, though her breathing was becoming laboured in the summer heat. "My doctor has advised me to avoid direct sunlight because of my medication. I have a medical exemption on file." "Rules are rules," Deborah insisted, calling over 2 other HOA board members. "If everyone claimed medical exceptions, we'd have chaos. Besides, I see no record of any exemption in our files." "I submitted it when I moved in," Margaret replied. "I have the receipt with Janice's signature." Deborah's eyes flashed. "Well, it appears to have been misplaced. You'll need to resubmit and wait for approval." The confrontation escalated as Margaret stood her ground, her voice growing weaker as her breathing became more difficult. The neighbours who had been chatting with her backed away, their momentary courage fading under Deborah's glare. Margaret reached into her bag for her inhaler, but Deborah mistook the motion. "No outside food or beverages at the pool," she snapped, swiftly confiscating Margaret's bag before she could retrieve her inhaler. "This will be returned to you when you leave." Margaret's breathing worsened rapidly. The familiar tightness in her chest intensified, and she felt the telltale wheezing begin. In her 30 years with the Bureau, she had faced down armed suspects and navigated life-threatening situations, but the helpless feeling of an asthma attack was different, a betrayal by her own body. "My inhaler," she wheezed, pointing at the bag now held by one of Deborah's associates, a nervous-looking man named Ted who served as the HOA treasurer. "I need my inhaler." "After you leave the pool area," Deborah said firmly, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as she noticed Margaret's rapidly paling complexion. "We can't make exceptions." "She can't breathe," said Frank Chen, stepping forward from the growing crowd. "Give her the medication." "This is ridiculous," added another resident, a nurse named Patricia. "I can see she's in respiratory distress." Deborah hesitated, then doubled down. "She's clearly faking to get around the rules. I've seen these tactics before." Margaret sank back into her chair, focusing on the breathing techniques her pulmonologist had taught her. Slow, controlled breaths through pursed lips. But the attack was progressing too quickly, her airways constricting as anxiety compounded the physical symptoms. Dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. Several residents began to gather, concerned by Margaret's obvious distress. Patricia moved to Margaret's side, checking her pulse and speaking calmly. "Her pulse is racing, and her lips are starting to turn blue," Patricia announced loudly. "This is a medical emergency. We need to call 911. "That won't be necessary," Deborah insisted. "She just needs to leave the pool area, and she can have her belongings back." "She can't walk in this condition," Patricia snapped, "and withholding emergency medication is potentially criminal." Ted shifted uncomfortably, still holding Margaret's bag. "Deborah, maybe we should." "Follow the procedures," Deborah cut him off. "If we start making exceptions." James, who had arrived late to the party, pushed through the crowd, his face tight with concern as he spotted his mother. "What's happening?" "Mom." His eyes widened at his mother's pale face and laboured breathing. "Where's your inhaler?" Margaret pointed weakly at her bag. James turned to Deborah, his face flushed with anger. "Give me my mother's bag." "Now." "Your mother is violating pool regulations," Deborah began, but James cut her off, stepping forward and snatching the bag from Ted's hands, who released it without resistance. "She's having an asthma attack, you idiots." He retrieved the inhaler and handed it to Margaret, who took 2 desperate puffs. The medication began to work almost immediately, and colour slowly returned to her cheeks. As Margaret's breathing eased, the tension in the crowd shifted palpably. Murmurs of disapproval grew louder, with several residents openly confronting Deborah. "You knew she had asthma," said Carlos. "This was in her medical exemption paperwork." "Which mysteriously disappeared," added Susan. "I've documented 4 other instances where medical exemptions were lost," Frank said, his normally quiet voice carrying across the pool deck. "All from residents who challenged HOA decisions." The crowd of residents murmured disapprovingly, many openly glaring at Deborah and her associates. Ted took a step away from Deborah, distancing himself both physically and symbolically. Patricia, still monitoring Margaret, looked up at the gathering crowd. "As a healthcare professional, I'm obligated to report the deliberate withholding of life-saving medication. This crosses the line from HOA enforcement to endangerment. Deborah's carefully maintained facade began to crack. We didn't know it was an emergency. The rules clearly state. The rules don't state anything about endangering lives. James interrupted, his arm protectively around his mother's shoulders. This isn't about rules anymore. As Margaret's breathing stabilized, a cold anger replaced her panic. 3 decades of FBI training and discipline had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to choose her moments carefully, and to recognize when a situation required the full weight of authority. This was such a moment. She gestured for James to help her stand. Though still unsteady, she straightened her shoulders and faced Deborah directly. The crowd fell silent, sensing something significant was about to happen. "In my career," Margaret began, her voice hoarse, but gaining strength with each word, "I've seen people abuse power in many ways. But rarely have I seen it wielded so pettily, with such disregard for basic human decency." Deborah's expression hardened. "Your career as what? A librarian? A school teacher? You don't understand the complexities of managing a community like." "I understand power dynamics better than most," Margaret interrupted. She straightened up, her hand steady as she reached into her bag again, this time withdrawing a leather wallet. She flipped it open, revealing her FBI credentials and ID card. Though retired, she had maintained her identification as was customary for senior agents. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even James looked surprised. He knew his mother's background, of course, but had never seen her reveal it so dramatically. "Deborah Harrington," Margaret said, her voice quiet, but carrying across the now-silent pool area. "What you just did was not simply a violation of HOA bylaws regarding medical accommodations. By knowingly withholding prescribed medical equipment during a respiratory emergency, you've potentially committed an act of reckless endangerment." The colour drained from Deborah's face. I didn't know." "Ignorance is not a defence," Margaret continued, her training evident in her measured tone. "Nor is it believable. As I filed my medical information with the HOA as required in Section 8.3 of the bylaws." Ted, the treasurer, stepped further away from Deborah. "She's right. I remember that paperwork. It was filed properly." "And mysteriously removed," Margaret added, "along with the documentation of at least 4 other residents with medical needs who had challenged HOA decisions." She turned to address the gathered residents. "For those who've been subject to similar treatment, I suggest we convene an emergency meeting of all homeowners. The bylaws, which I've studied thoroughly, provide for removal of board members who abuse their authority." Patricia, the nurse, stepped forward. "I'll testify to what I witnessed here today. This crossed every ethical and legal line." "As will I," added Frank Chen. "I've kept records of every violation notice, every inconsistent enforcement." "So have I," said Carlos, holding up his phone, "including a recording of Deborah telling me last month that the rules don't apply the same way to everyone." Others began to speak up, a chorus of grievances long suppressed by fear of retaliation. Deborah's carefully constructed authority crumbled visibly. She looked from face to face, finding no allies. Even her board members were backing away, unwilling to be associated with what had just transpired. "You can't do this," she said, her voice hollow. "I've run this community for 7 years. I've maintained property values, enforced standards. You've bullied residents, ignored medical needs, and selectively enforced rules," Margaret countered. "That ends today." "And if it doesn't," James added, his arm still protectively around his mother, "I'm sure Mom still has contacts at the FBI's Public Corruption Division." They love cases involving abuse of power, especially when they're this well documented. Margaret hadn't planned to leverage her FBI connections. Her goal was community reform, not criminal charges, but she didn't correct her son. Sometimes the impression of power was as effective as its exercise, a lesson she had learned early in her career. Deborah's phone rang, breaking the tense silence. She glanced at the screen, then back at the crowd surrounding her. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly toward the pool exit, her heels no longer clicking with confidence, but scraping uncertainly against the concrete. Word spread quickly through Aspen Ridge about FBI Margaret and the pool party confrontation. Within hours, residents who hadn't witnessed the event firsthand received multiple versions of the story via text messages, phone calls, and impromptu gatherings on driveways and front porches. By sunset, the community buzzed with a new energy, part indignation, part hope. Margaret found herself fielding visits from neighbours she'd never met, each with their own story of HOA overreach. Her dining room table became command central as she helped residents document their experiences and organise their evidence. "I never thought we could actually do anything about it," said Elaine Murray, an elderly resident who had been fined for planting tulips instead of the approved daffodils. "We all just paid the fines and kept our heads down." "That's how intimidation works," Margaret explained. "Isolated individuals rarely resist, even when they know something is wrong. Emails circulated, doors were knocked on, and within days, a petition calling for an emergency HOA meeting gathered signatures from over 70% of the community's residents, far exceeding the 40% required by the bylaws. The meeting, held in the crowded community centre, was unlike any in Aspen Ridge's history. Residents who had previously remained silent out of fear shared their own stories of arbitrary enforcement and excessive fines. Margaret, now fully recovered, presented a detailed analysis of bylaw violations committed by the HOA board itself, including failure to properly disclose financial records and improper approval processes for board-friendly renovations. For the past 3 weeks, Margaret said, standing before the packed room, "I've documented 47 instances of selective enforcement, 23 cases of procedural violations by the board, and 12 incidents where medical accommodations were improperly denied." She displayed a series of charts and graphs projecting the data for all to see. The FBI analyst in her had compiled the information meticulously, with timestamps, cross-references, and corroborating evidence. "What's most concerning," she continued, "is the pattern of financial discrepancies in vendor contracts." She displayed a spreadsheet highlighting suspicious patterns in landscaping and maintenance contracts, all awarded to companies with connections to board members. These relationships were never disclosed as required in Section 15.2 of the bylaws. The audience gasped as the numbers appeared on screen, tens of thousands of dollars in questionable transactions. Deborah, seated in the back corner with her remaining allies, attempted to interrupt. "These are baseless accusations. They're documented facts," Margaret countered calmly, "and I've already forwarded this documentation to the county prosecutor's office for review." She hadn't actually done so yet, would only do so if absolutely necessary, but the statement had its intended effect. 2 board members immediately stood and distanced themselves from Deborah, claiming they had been kept in the dark about the financial irregularities. "I'm not interested in punishment," Margaret told the assembly, her voice softening. "I'm interested in reform. This community deserves governance based on fairness, transparency, and common sense." The vote was decisive. Deborah and 2 other board members were removed, replaced by a new leadership committee that included Margaret as an advisor on bylaw revision. Her first recommendation, approved unanimously, was the addition of clear medical exception protocols and mandatory first aid training for all board members. 6 months later, Aspen Ridge had transformed. The revised bylaws were reasonable and fairly enforced. Margaret's wildflower garden became a model for water conservation, with several neighbours adopting similar approaches. Community events were characterised by inclusion rather than restriction. James visited regularly, delighted by the change in both the community and his mother. He found her one afternoon in her garden, chatting amicably with neighbours, her FBI credentials, now a known but rarely mentioned part of her identity. "You know," he said as they shared tea on her porch, "most people retire to get away from conflict and drama." Margaret smiled, watching hummingbirds dart among her flowers. Old habits die hard. Besides, sometimes the most important battles are the small ones, close to home. She patted her pocket where her inhaler rested, now a symbol not of weakness, but of the day she had helped her community breathe easier in more ways than one. Frank Chen appeared at her garden gate, holding a tray of seedlings. "Ready for phase 2 of the butterfly garden, Margaret?" "Absolutely," she replied, rising to greet him. "And I've got the approval forms right here, approved in record time by the new committee." As she walked toward her neighbour, Margaret realised she had found something in retirement that had sometimes been missing even in her distinguished FBI career, not just the satisfaction of justice served, but the deeper fulfillment of community transformed. In Aspen Ridge, she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was helping build something better.